very much for being here today.
My name is Oscar Turan. I'm the director of the DREAM Center here at UCI. DREAM is an acronym. It stands for the values of the center: diversity, resilience, empowerment, advocacy, and mentorship. And in our center, we serve undocumented students here on campus.
Yeah. My name is Ana Miriam Barragan Santoyo. You can call me Ana. And I'm the assistant director of the DREAM Center.
And we also wanted to thank our partners that have allowed us to be here today and supported this presentation. In particular, Office of Inclusive Excellence for bringing this all together, and the Division of Teaching Excellence and Innovation for also supporting us in doing this presentation. And thank you for coming, of course, and the important work that you all do as mentors. Our hope is that with the information we go over today, you can learn basic context about the laws and policies that are applicable here, some of the terminology that you're going to hear in this space when we're talking about undocumented students, and some really concrete ally strategies that you can use as you encounter students that are impacted by these issues.
And this is just a brief introduction, so we do encourage you to register for the AB 540 and Undocumented Student Ally Training. It's a 5-hour training, but after today, you're definitely gonna understand at least some of the basics and the laws that impact undocumented students.
And we'll be sharing these slides with all the veterans.
Correct.
So they don't
Yes.
have to take notes.
Yeah, correct. Thank you so much for mentioning
And
that.
5 hours seems like a lot, but it actually goes by. It's a really fun day. We've got some alums in the room, so maybe if you want to spread the word about how it was a great fun day, you learn a lot. There's lunch, we provide snacks. And actually, the last Ally training that we just did, we had a faculty member that had recently joined us from UCLA. And he said that previously he had been, I think, at UCSB, so he had seen a undocumented student ally training. This was now the 3rd time. And he said we were the best. So, yeah.
Not a competition.
But we won.
And we wanted to start off with letting you know about the population that we have here at UCI. So we have about 700 undocumented students, but it wasn't the same, right, every single year. So in fall 2015 was actually the last time we requested statistics from our students, actually more detailed statistics, right? And we knew that out of the 537 undocumented students, we had about 1/4 of them were actually transfer students. We had very little graduate students. We only had 6. The current number is 24 that we know of. And so we know that that number is increasing, right, every single year. But we also know that 5 of our students were non-AB 540. And I'll talk about what non-AB 540 means, because actually there are, that we know of, about 3 to 4 non-AB 540 graduate students, okay? And that really impacts their situation here at UCI. I just wanted to show you as well, like the increase in numbers, right, every single year. Starting 2012, the California DREAM Act, and I'm gonna talk about it later on too, really pushed and allowed undocumented students to enroll in higher education institutions because they were able to receive financial aid. So that's why we start seeing an increase of number every single year until now, right?
Oh, and I think one important takeaway to have with those numbers as well is to know that we do have the largest cohort of undocumented students of any UC campus in the state. So you may not necessarily think of Irvine as an epicenter of undocumented student issues. I certainly didn't until I started working here, but in fact we are. And we're really, hopefully, setting some of the best practices for our colleagues that have smaller class sizes than we do. And the other trend that's interesting to note in those slides that we just went over is that there was that pretty significant year-over-year increase starting in 2012. It slows down dramatically this past year. We would have anticipated growth far beyond what we had. And the reason why was these commitments to register that manifested in fall of 2017 would have been made right in the wake of the election. And so given the climate, we are seeing how the uncertainty, the political rhetoric that's flying around, all of this is impacting the decisions that folks are making related to higher education.
And one of the most beautiful parts of our jobs, I believe, is the fact that we work with an extremely diverse population. I'm not just talking about ethnicity and race. We're talking about non-traditional students as well, right? But in terms of ethnicity here, the last time the registrar office gave us this information, we know that we had the majority of our students were identified as Mexican American or Chicano, Chicana, but we do have a very significant population of students coming from Korea. And then we have also a very significant population of students coming from Central and South America. And then we have smaller percentages, but we have students coming from the Philippines, China, Japan, Vietnam, Cambodia. We have students who self-identify as Black coming from African countries and Latin American countries as well. And we also have a significant number of students who self-identify as white coming from Canada, Australia, Russia. We have a student who's British. So we do have a very significant population of students who are not Latinx, right? And we know that that's one of the biggest stereotypes about undocumented immigrants, that this is only affecting the Latinx community. But as you see here, we work with an extremely diverse population of students. So the first takeaway from here is that you cannot assume who's undocumented. When you're talking to people, I don't want you to only talk about AB 540 and the laws and the policies and the resources only to your Latinx students, okay? I want you to share that with everyone as well.
So we wanted to do a quick dive into the terminology because this is something that's really on the forefront of the media right now. You're probably reading all kinds of stories or seeing things on television that are talking about immigration and undocumented immigration in particular. Despite that awareness, though, we really don't, most people don't know what the terms mean. And we don't often get to hear explanations as to what are these terms that are thrown around so commonly. So starting off with just status, what do we mean when we talk about undocumented? So in the United States, the way that our immigration law is set up is that essentially, if you're not a citizen, then you need permission to be physically present in the country. That permission is status. And status can take one of two forms. It can be immigrant status or non-immigrant status. Immigrant status is permission to be in the country that's intended to be permanent. So this is someone that intends to live the rest of their life in the United States. Typically, we refer to them as green card holders, even though the card's no longer green, but it used to be back in the day. So this is someone that has permanent residency. The other classification, non-immigrant status, would be someone that has permission to be here as a non-citizen, but for a temporary defined period of time. Someone that's here pursuing higher education as an international student, perhaps someone that is here working under a work visa that has a predefined time, or someone, most common example, someone that's here for vacation, visiting, and has a tourist visa. Some of the differences between the immigrant and non-immigrant statuses will determine the legal benefits that are available to the individual. Now, if you don't have any of those forms of permission, that's how you become undocumented. And there are really two ways to end up undocumented. You can enter the United States without inspection, meaning you didn't come through an official port of entry, you didn't go through customs, you didn't get the passport stamp. You were smuggled into the country. The other way that you can end up undocumented is you had permission at one time. Let's say you were a non-immigrant who came here for vacation and you had that tourist visa, but you actually decide to stay past the expiration of that visa. Now, despite a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing in the media right now, the vast majority, about 73% of undocumented individuals in the country, aren't the ones that come in across the border without inspection. They're actually folks that come in with lawful permission, a status of some type, and then overstay that temporary status.
And we have students who self-identify very, very differently, right? Like the spectrum for undocumented students, it's very different, right? We have students, for example, who are very open about being undocumented, and they're undocumented, unafraid, unapologetic. But then we have this group of students, right, who prefer to actually use the words such as dreamer, right? And dreamer has a more positive connotation because nobody hates on dreamers, right? And so students will tend to use that terminology. However, the word has actually become a little bit more problematic, right? We know that we have always created this version of a good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. And so for a lot of people right now, the good immigrant are the dreamers, right? Like the youth who have assimilated to the American culture and go to college and X, Y, and Z. But at the same time, that means that they're criminalizing their parents, right? For bringing them here, because it wasn't the dreamer's choice to come here, but it was the parents' choice, right? So it has become problematic. However, like one of the things that we suggest is like just to use the language that people will be using with you, okay? We have students who now have DACA, and we're gonna go over what DACA means. But DACA really impacted a lot of youth. So for students, they didn't want to say that they were undocumented, so they would say, oh, I'm a DACA recipient, or I'm DACA-mented, okay? And then we have AB 540 as well. Like you would think, like, why would a student self-identify as a law, right? Well, AB 540 also made a huge impact on the access, right, into higher education for undocumented students. So for them, it became an identity as well, as I'm an AB 540 student. And then we have identities like that are intersectional, right? Like undocu-black or undocu-queer as well.
So we wanted to give you some scenarios to talk through what these issues might actually look like as you're interacting with students. All of these scenarios are grounded in experiences that we've had, conversations we've had with students, and issues that we've seen come up in the classroom and in interactions more informally with mentors and with professors. So in this first scenario, we kind of wanted to talk about how identity, self-identification, and terminology can really come into play for individuals. I'll go ahead and read the scenario. So a graduate student is documented, but has recently faced the prospect of losing their DACA status due to the federal rescission. The student will lose the ability to TA once they lose their DACA work permit. The student would like to stay at UCI, but is at a loss for what to do. They have come to you to ask for assistance, but have shared that they absolutely want no one to know that they're undocumented. They are not comfortable using the term undocumented. They don't use it themselves when they talk about themselves. And they have asked not to have their case discussed with anyone in email because they're very sensitive to creating a paper trail regarding the problem that they're facing. You ask the student if you can connect them with the Dream Center. The student says yes, and then you contact the Dream Center, describe the situation to us, and ask us to connect with the student. So in this particular scenario, there's a couple of issues that we hope surface for you. Does anyone have any questions about this? Would you have done this differently? What do you think about the course of action that this professor took in helping this student?
I would have the student contact the Dream Center, not the other way around.
So we have someone say they would have the student themselves contact the Dream Center. And I'm going to repeat back the answers for sake of our recording. Okay, that's one way that might have been a little bit different. Out of curiosity, why would you have preferred the student to make the contact themselves?
Well, they don't want other people to know. So that keeps their privacy.
The confidentiality issue that comes into play. Any other thoughts about this scenario? Yes.
I guess intuitively, I just would want to let them know that, you know, I'm here to help. And I don't know to what extent if that's something that they would want to hear in this particular scenario.
So that desire of wanting to let them know that you're here to help, but how do you do that in a way that the student will be receptive to and maybe respects where they're at as well, because they may not be in a place to want to hear that. Yes?
I think I might be inclined to take a few more steps before sending the student to you guys, I mean, or along with sending the student to you guys. It seems like because departments handle assistance so differently, it might be worth doing a little legwork for the student within the department, within the school, before or as also sending them to you. Maybe walking them over there. I mean, some of the problem with telling a student, oh, there's this Dream Center, here, contact them, can sometimes be that they just don't, it's a step to take to get over there. So sometimes I've walked students.
So wanting to provide maybe some more direct support immediately before referring them out somewhere, wanting to know more about any internal opportunities there might be to support the student and understand their particular situation a little bit better before connecting them with someone else. And I think the other thing that's important to note there that sort of ties into what you're talking about is undoubtedly with this scenario, the student's got a whole host of issues that they're going to have to sort through. Some of them are related to immigration law. Some of them are related to their ability to work. Some of them are related to financial aid that the student may or may not be able to receive within the institution. So the knowledge needed to help the student is going to live in a lot of different places, right? It's not just a matter of referring them to one source of support. Yes?
I would want to reach out to the Dream Center myself first. And I would want to find out from you guys, tell me what some of my options are and perhaps what the best way would be for me to work with the student. I'm happy to walk them over to you, and I think that's a great suggestion. But I think it's important for me to know where I am, because the student is clearly uncomfortable and in a very precarious situation given what's going on in our country. And so I would want to make sure that they were protected and didn't feel like they were just being kind of shuttled off, oh, go there. Because sometimes just giving somebody a referral just makes them feel like you don't want to do anything.
Exactly. So respecting the relationship of trust that's been established by the student and the significant need that they have by actually having that first contact with our center yourself and maybe learning more about what are the resources available.
Yeah. I think some of the takeaways here, right? I think it's definitely meeting the students. Oh, you had an additional comment? Please.
On your comment, what about having some policies documented of kind of how the Dream Center keeps the students' information confidential, and so that the student would have, you know, some documentation of like, if I do approach the Dream Center, this is what will happen, or this is what will not happen for me.
Absolutely. So having some maybe printed information or resources available to explain confidentiality as it relates to the Dream Center's work to that student as they consider connecting with us.
And one of the things that Oscar and I actually do in every presentation, we talk about FERPA, right? Because students' privacy and confidentiality is really crucial, and most of the time they are afraid to have their names on emails or papers or things like that as well. So I think that's really good. And always to bring it up, right? Like that FERPA does protect the students' information. One of the great parts of the scenario was that that person, right, that the student came to actually asked the student, is it okay for me to contact the Dream Center? Right? Because it's really important to get students' permission. In this particular scenario, right, like the student just didn't want people to know, right? So also having an in-person meeting made it easier for us to just talk among ourselves, right? And not generate any like email conversations or anything like that about the student. One of the things that we definitely recommend is just meeting the students where they're at, not encouraging them to do anything that they're very uncomfortable about. So sometimes the student will be referred to the Dream Center, but they might not want to come to us directly, right? So the best way to, to proceed is actually for you to contact the Dream Center and find a little bit more information, okay? The other one here is if the student comes to you and they say, I'm undocumented, you try to feel as comfortable as possible using the word undocumented yourself, right? If the student says, I'm an AB 540 student, that's the terminology that you should be using as well. So again, meeting the student where they are at, right? And then the last one, we cannot emphasize this enough. Privacy and confidentiality are extremely, extremely important to undocumented students. That's why a lot of the times they don't disclose their immigration status, but you should feel privileged one way or another if a student does come to you and discloses that kind of information, because that means that the student trusted you, right? And you should keep that information to yourself and no one else, unless of course the student is at harm or something else, right? Would you like to add anything, Oscar? Okay. We keep talking about AB 540. AB 540. What's AB 540, right? Assembly Bill 540 passed in 2001, and the reason why it impacted undocumented students is because anyone here in California who met the requirements for AB 540 could pay in-state tuition. One of the biggest mistakes, though, is that people assume that AB 540 is only for undocumented students. Here at the university, actually in the UC system, 72% of AB 540 students are actually USA citizens, okay? So AB 540 does not equal undocumented. Undocumented students just benefit from AB 540, and that's why some of them will say, I'm an AB 540 student, right? In addition to that, it took years. Oh, yes.
Can you repeat that,
Definitely.
that clarification again?
Mm-hmm. So AB 540 is for students who meet a specific criteria. For example, go to a California high school for 3 years, graduate from a California high school, and then enrolled in a public institution, right? Which means that USA citizens can also benefit from that law. An example of this is, for example, somebody who joined the Army right after high school, and they moved to another state, they were deployed to another country. When they come back for college, they pay in-state tuition because of AB 540. And here at the UC system, 72% of AB 540 students are actually USA citizens, okay? Mm-hmm.
Is AB 540 involved in people who come to California and establish residency, or is that a completely separate category?
That's a different category unless the student is claiming residency or in-state tuition, right? Asking for in-state tuition based on them maybe growing up here in California and going to California high schools, right? And then maybe they moved out to another state, they lived there for a couple of years, and then they want to return to California, then yes, they could potentially establish in-state tuition, residency and pay in-state tuition through AB 540. We do have to acknowledge that actually Oscar and I, we don't have the right to give information to students about AB 540 or whether they qualify for it or not. The only office that has the right to do this is actually the university registrar. They handle all the applications, and because things have gotten actually really complicated, okay? So we have AB 540, and that had a set requirements. Now we have AB 2000, and just recently this year, we now have SB 68. Those two laws actually expanded the eligibility for who qualified for AB 540, right? So we don't usually mention AB 2000, SB 68, because again, it just expanded the eligibility for AB 540. But just know that now under AB 540 and under these laws, a lot more students do qualify for in-state tuition, like non-traditional students. For example, maybe somebody didn't go to high school, but they went to adult school. And maybe they skip adult school, but they went to community college. And once they transfer to UCI, they may be able to establish residency, okay?
It basically looks like someone who's had significant educational contacts with the state of California, regardless of whether or not they're actually a resident of the state.
Yeah. And here at the UC system as well, President Napolitano actually added an additional residency policy for DACA recipients who are coming out of state, okay? Again, Oscar and I are not really allowed to give information to students about whether they qualify or not, because they have very specific requirements as well, but they call it the UC DACA only policy. So if the student meets the criteria and they are coming out of state, for example, after 1 year and 1 day, they may be able to establish residency here in California.
Do these laws apply both to undergraduates as well as graduate students?
Yes, correct. These policies, well, except for the UC only, right? That's UC only. But AB 540, AB 2000, SB 68 actually applies to any public university. So private universities actually can deny in-state tuition to undocumented students. Mm-hmm.
Just to clarify, so this
Yeah.
AB 540 is just only for tuition purposes?
Correct. Correct.
It's about the price tag that you pay to go to school here at a public institution.
Yeah. And I mean, we know the differences between in-state tuition and out-of-state, right? So that's why it really impacted students. And when AB 540 passed, you also saw an increase, right, of undocumented students enrolling in higher education. Even if it was at the community college level, they were able to pay that out of pocket, right? The in-state tuition rather than out-of-state. Dr. Morales?
UC DACA only? DACA is a federal program, right?
Yes.
And so the policy that President Napolitano has gives out-of-state students in-state residency after 1 day?
After 1 year and 1 day.
1 year and 1 day.
If they meet other requirements as well. Yeah.
So in a sense, it's similar to AB 540, the outcome, in some ways.
Yes.
The tuition ones. Okay.
Exactly.
It's a UC-specific expansion of AB 540.
And this is not very public. The UC DACA only policy, a lot of people don't know about. That's why every time you meet with an undocumented student who's, let's say, enrolling in your graduate program, and they have questions about in-state tuition, you should always, always refer that student to the registrar office.
And just as an interesting aside, there's a lot of issues or sometimes even legal legal benefits or legal statuses that are available in the work that we do that are really great, but that people don't really talk about too much in our work, because this is really high profile, very highly politicized things. And so, for example, no one is having a parade talking about how the UC is rolling this out, right? Even though it's a great benefit to students that are able to receive it. So just be aware that students themselves are not always totally cognizant of all of the things that might be available to them.
Yeah.
How are they informed of it? Unless they already have some inkling to go to somebody and ask about it.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
A lot of students are not informed. And it's also a way of, it's a coping mechanism for a lot of the students to avoid learning about immigration because they don't want to deal with it, right? And there are students who really don't know who to go to, or those who will do their own research online and at the end of the day be extremely confused about reading policies and laws, right? So by the end of today, I'm not exaggerating by saying that you're gonna learn and you're gonna know a lot more than some undocumented students themselves.
And it really emphasizes the importance of these networks of knowledge that we create every time we do one of these presentations. You all now are in the best position to be that first line of contact to students that you're teaching or mentoring. So you at least sort of recognize the flags, and maybe you can point them in the right direction so they can find out about these benefits and protections. Yes?
When did that UC DACA policy get rolled out? Was it ever announced? Was it just kind of like quietly released? When did that happen?
It happened about, I want to say 2 to 3 years ago.
Okay, so it's not this year.
Not this year, no. And it was something, you know, quietly done. The coordinators, for example, where all of us got an email saying, this is happening. President Napolitano is announcing the DACA-only policy. However, go to the registrar office, right? And so the registrar office is the one that knows every little detail about this policy. Mm-hmm. Dr. Morales?
So AB 540 is a California law.
Correct.
And DACA, which qualifies students for in-state tuition.
Mm-hmm.
DACA is a federal program which grants work authorization.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some California students that don't qualify for AB 540, but they could still get in-state tuition through the UC DACA only.
Correct.
They have DACA.
Exactly.
Correct.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's pretty.
What about students from out of state, who are just from out of state, or like somebody's from Texas and they're undocumented? They can get residency through this program?
If they have DACA. And it's not that they obtain residency, it's that for tuition purposes, they would be treated as in-state residents.
But there's benefits of actually being AB 540 and not being qualifying for residency policies, right? AB 540 students are actually considered non-residents here at the university, and they may be able to qualify for other like funding, fellowships that DACA-only students who qualify under this policy do not qualify for. Yeah, so it makes a difference, right? The reason why this is also not advertised is because the registrar office does not want students to be like, hey, like I want my classification to be resident and not non-resident, because it sounds better, but it's not better for their situation.
And for the sake of time, we're just going to keep going on, but certainly keep those questions, and we'll try to address them maybe towards the end. you want to do this?
Yeah, we have a scenario. Does anybody want to volunteer to read it? How about here? No? Yes?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, a student comes to office hours because he missed an exam. He shares that he is undocumented and has been missing class in order to meet with an immigration lawyer. What are some supportive ways the professor or TA can respond to this scenario?
Thank you. And we would love for you to have a discussion on this.
I had precisely this situation happen to me.
Okay.
And we went over what his, what his plan was, what he was doing, and the time that he needed to get his, because it was a month after the inauguration, and so he had a time limit, and so I just said, go do what you need to do. You can get an incomplete, and then so he just kind of, after he took care of it, he came back and then we worked through the incomplete. And that's what we did.
Fantastic.
Does anybody else have a real scenario as well? Professor.
I had a student who wasn't undocumented but had court, was missing class for court reasons. And so I have pop quizzes and they're scheduled, but they're to make sure the students have done the readings. So I just had him turn into me short paragraphs on each of the readings so that he didn't miss the quizzes.
Yeah.
So, and then I would share with him I share with all the students the slides that I use for the class, and so that he could kind of keep up with the class even when he wasn't.
Great. So providing opportunities to keep up with the material and providing an alternative in terms of the work as opposed to the in-class quizzes. And hopefully no one here has ever had to go through a court proceeding, but if you ever have, and as an attorney I can tell you they're really pretty arduous, right? And they're happening during business hours, and they happen very quickly. And one thing in particular within the field of immigration law, so many immigration forms of relief or things that we can do for someone that's undocumented are tied to age. There's a really specific cutoff of when the clock is ticking. And one of the most important ages related to those forms of relief is actually 21. So it's pretty squarely within some of the students that we serve. So you may have someone that just suddenly has to get this done, right? They've got a quick turnaround related to something connected to their legal case.
Many of the supportive steps that the colleagues have mentioned already I've done, but I just want to mention that in one situation, the student was a U.S. citizen. It was her sister and mom who were undocumented, and that had direct implications on her life because she had to effectively represent them in many domains, including for legal purposes.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up because we do work with a significant number of students who are from mixed status families, right? They might be USA citizens, but their family members are undocumented. You had a comment?
I just treated it as an excused absence. We have a fairly small major population, so I knew the person was likely telling me the truth. And anytime somebody says they have an appointment with an immigration lawyer in order to stay in the country or some language such as that, that's all that needs to be said. Is that I work with it as if they told me they broke their leg and they have to go and set it, and we'll deal with what you missed.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And a couple of things. So a couple of things on this scenario as well, right? The flexibility, providing that alternative, listening to the students as well, right? And I think being flexible is the most important part. And I know this doesn't apply just to undocumented students, but you opening up about supporting undocumented students, they're gonna start coming in, starting to talk to you more often about their situations as well, right? You wanna go over this one?
Oh, that's okay.
Or
I mean, these actually capture some of the statements that we've heard that you used. as you've encountered these scenarios. So it sounds like people are actually on the right track, but just know that this is a real need. It's a significant need. It can be very disruptive to the lives of the students facing legal proceedings. And if you had any questions about how to support a student going through that, feel free to reach out to us.
And one of the things as well that somebody mentioned here is like, well, how can I help you, right? The student might not be articulating how they need your help, but once you ask that question, they'll have a clear answer as well, right?
Is there concern with abuse of this? Like with anything else with undergraduate students? They often say that something happened in their lives in order to avoid coming to the final and stuff like this.
So a question about, is there a concern for abuse of this? How do you evaluate the credibility of someone that's asking for this type of accommodation? I mean, certainly I would defer to the wisdom in the room about that. I'm sure you all have a sense of how you evaluate the credibility of individual students. But just be aware that this is so real and so pressing for so many of our students right now that, number one, I think it would probably be unlikely that someone would raise this as an excuse if it wasn't valid. And it's so timely that it's not going to be uncommon to encounter students that are facing significant legal burdens outside of the classroom at this particular moment.
Yeah.
I would just add that, I mean, I would assume that people are going to be scared to say this stuff.
Yeah.
It puts them and their families at risk. So bringing this up is not like a good excuse for this It's a scary thing.
There's a lot of disincentives actually for someone to identify themselves this way.
And for example, we have actually a seminar, and the student texted me, she's like, I'm gonna be late because the meeting with the attorney is actually taking longer than expected, right? So things like that happen as well, yeah. We also talked about the California Dream Act a little bit, and we said dreamer, 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 right? And why students self-identify as this. This doesn't impact graduate students the same way that it impacts undergraduates, but the reason why I want to mention it is because a lot of the graduate programs will request the graduate students to complete FAFSA, right? They should not be completing FAFSA. Even if they're undocumented with a work authorization permit and a social security number, they should always, always be using the California Dream Act, okay? We do get a lot of questions in our office about graduate students coming into UCI saying like, well, the department says FAFSA, right? And I was like, okay, talk to the department or tell me who you're in contact with, that way I can call them. Because FAFSA, it has, or the California Dream Act has actually the same exact questions as FAFSA, except the question on citizenship status, right? That's the only one. So you can still use the California Dream Act application to determine the student's eligibility for aid or extra funding or X, Y, and Z, okay?
So are you saying we could use that for all of our students?
This is only for undocumented students, but if you have an undocumented student entering your program, please do not ask them to complete FAFSA. Ask them to complete the California Dream Act instead.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe briefly, like why it's sort of dangerous for undocumented students to be completing FAFSA.
Yeah, so undocumented immigrants do not qualify for anything that is federally funded, right? Research opportunities sometimes, or fellowships, X, Y, and Z, right? So completing FAFSA puts them at risk in the future when they're applying for residency. And one of the worst scenarios actually happened in Southern California, where a very well-intentioned ally told the student, just apply for FAFSA, nobody's gonna find out. She was deported, okay? So please, please do not encourage students to apply for something they do not qualify for, or to lie on applications. This can truly have an extremely negative impact on their lives and their families' lives as well, okay?
So DACA, we're hearing so much about DACA right now. But before I sort of explain briefly what DACA is, I also want to highlight the fact that the vast majority of undocumented youth in this country, over 80%, are not DACA qualified. Everyone's talking about DACA, and understandably so because of what happened with the rescission, but DACA has always been a small subset of undocumented youth. And the experience of non-DACA undocumented individuals is significantly more challenging and a lot harder in many ways. But one of the things that's been so difficult for folks that don't qualify for DACA or don't have DACA is that the entire conversation has been DACA focused. Let's talk about DACA. I'm so sorry you're going to lose DACA. What can we do to save DACA? What does that do to someone that never benefited from this program and was never able to? So just be cognizant that as you interact with students, there will be many students that don't have DACA. Now, talking about DACA, though, because it has been on the forefront of the immigration conversation for the past year, DACA is a federal program that was created in 2012 by the Obama administration, and it provides really 3 essential protections to recipients. The first is protection against deportation. The second is the ability to lawfully work in the United States with a federal work permit and a social security number. And the third was advanced parole, which provided the opportunity for the very first time for an undocumented individual to leave the United States and then lawfully return back into the country. And the reason you needed advanced parole to do that was if you don't have status, if you're not a citizen, if you don't have a US passport, if you go on vacation and you leave, but then you try to come back, you're not going to be able to get through the border. You'd have to smuggle yourself in, which of course is incredibly dangerous. People lose their lives all the time. It can be incredibly expensive to do that. It's not something that someone would undertake lightly. So for the most part, before advanced parole, undocumented folks were trapped within the United States. Now, what's going on with DACA? The short answer is we have no idea. Is DACA dead? Is DACA alive? Is DACA going to survive? We don't know. It's kind of anyone's guess at this point, and I'll save you all the technicalities of the convoluted path to where we're at right now. Essentially, DACA is on life support. It's barely hanging on, and we don't know what's going to happen next. Currently, if you are a DACA recipient whose grant expires within a certain period of time, you are able to do a DACA renewal. So you can get one more 2-year grant. That is the result of a court case. And we're not sure how long that decision, that temporary injunction that allows us, is going to be in place. It might die as soon as early July. We'll find out. There are other court cases, including one that potentially could bring back the entire program of DACA. That decision is currently on hold. The federal government was given an opportunity of 90 days after that decision was issued to revise their legal justification for ending DACA. And if they do a good enough job of that, then the court says, okay, then we'll let you kill it. But the current justification you gave isn't sufficient. And if you don't come up with a better one, then it's going to come back. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen with that. But there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Know that one way or the other, though, even if DACA was to continue to survive in whole, in its current format, one of the requirements, actually a series of the requirements, tie to age, tie to the date in which the person first became present in the US. And because of the way that these dates are moving, right, this criteria was static in time when the program was created, but we've continued to move. Fewer and fewer students, even if DACA came back, would be eligible. So the way that I'm sort of approaching this right now is we're living in a post-DACA world, one way or another. And what that means is that as supporters of students, as mentors of students, just be aware that folks are going to need opportunities that don't connect to their DACA status.
Oh, yes. Which leads us to this scenario. Oh, I will read it. An undergraduate student you are working with has expressed a desire to pursue a PhD. However, the student lacks DACA and they do not know how this might impact their ability to attend grad school. The student knows they cannot work and they have heard that they cannot receive financial aid. The student asks for your advice on what to do. You tell them, the student, that you were an international student yourself and that once you enter grad school in the US, the university you were at sponsored you for residency and a work permit. You advise the student to pursue a PhD as a path to residency, and you tell them they should target UCI because of what they would like to study. Yes, comments?
I don't recommend because may I ask you a question? I mean, can you apply for residency through a graduate program when you are undocumented?
No. So one of the complications here is that there is a different set of rules for international students with an F1 visa than there is for individuals who are undocumented and have nothing. And in fact, some of the pathways available with that F1 visa are by definition completely closed to someone that doesn't have current status.
Yeah. To get an F1 visa, you have to be in your country of citizenship.
Yes. Yeah.
If they were to leave to their native country, would they be able to get that?
So that process is called consular processing, meaning for certain types of permission or status visas, you need to actually be present in your country of origin or wherever your passport is issued from. The problem with that, though, is once an undocumented individual leaves the United States to go back to their country of birth and they apply for one of these forms of immigration relief there, part of the interview and fact development is to figure out whether or not they had been unlawfully present in the United States, which then provides a legal bar to accessing those visas, even from their home country. So they may essentially end up trapped if they go back.
And let's say there is a scenario where perhaps a student did go through all of this just to get the F1 visa. Because they're F1 visa now, they don't qualify for in-state tuition because they don't qualify for AB 540, right? So now they have to pay out-of-state tuition. Yeah. So this is not, this actually happened. The student was recommended to do this. Then the student came to Oscar and I to talk about her financial aid options. And we are very honest about the reality that this student should be looking for additional options, right? Which leads us to some of the recommendations here, right? You have to acknowledge that there are barriers for undocumented students for funding, right? One of the things that Oscar just asked, right, is for you to start thinking about like funding options for undocumented students without a work authorization, because we know a lot of the graduate students do depend on their TA-ships, right? But they can only become a TA if they have a work authorization permit. So what do you do when the student doesn't have that social security number and is not allowed to work here at the university, right? So we ask you to be creative. We ask you to create these funding opportunities for undocumented graduate students. And the last one, right? We do encourage you to talk to students about other options post-graduation that perhaps might not be in academia, right? In this particular case, the student is brilliant. She's in computer sciences. She could become a contractor, an independent contractor. She could start her own little business, right? Rather than maybe pursuing a PhD in computer science as of now.
One thing is that we have 14 students who are coming in the fall, who are graduate students who are undocumented. And I don't know how many, one of the challenges here is that the student has to reveal that information to somebody to know so that we handle it properly.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how that actually is, how we get to find out if a student in our programs are undocumented.
Yeah. Most of the students we work with have to self-disclose. Oscar and I do not have the list of undocumented students enrolled at the university. One, because of FERPA, but two, it's a way of also protecting the student's identity, right? And not generating any sort of list where our computers can be hacked or X, Y, and Z, right? So the students are gonna have to come to us. Most of the time though, when graduate students do enroll in a graduate program and they're having issues, that's when they tend to come to us, right? The department or the student themselves too.
And I think that's an unfortunate reality, right? Is we see people sometimes when things go wrong or they're about to go wrong. But one of the things that we can do in a concrete way is just try to make sure that the culture of UCI is in a visible and genuine way, inclusive of undocumented individuals. And the more ally stickers that they see, and the more that they maybe hear conversations where they can clearly identify professors that understand this area and maybe use the right terminology, the more likely, hopefully, that that student will feel comfortable identifying themselves, maybe before something goes terribly wrong. right?
I saw your hand up first, and then we'll come back to both of you.
I don't understand bullet number 2. Look for opportunities to provide funding opportunities to students that do not require work authorization. How?
So a way is when professors actually write grants. They, depending on the language, sometimes you say that you want to hire students, but if a student doesn't have a work authorization permit, you can't hire them, right? But if your language includes create fellowships for students to conduct research in my lab or X, Y, and Z, then you can transfer that fellowship through financial aid.
It's a nuanced point, but essentially a fellowship, a scholarship, a stipend is not employment. That doesn't flow through HR, right? So it's just being cognizant that perhaps even within your work and how the funding is structured, you may be able to create opportunities that do not require employment that are supportive of students. The other thing too is by virtue of being faculty members, you all are connected in really, really fantastic ways, right? And you may hear of other fellowships that are available outside, scholarships from independent organizations outside of the university. Just make sure that to the extent you become aware of opportunities that do not require employment, you share those with students.
I was a student who came to the United States and had a hard time getting a social security number. The reason was that unless you have a social security number, you won't be paid, no matter for what you do. So you needed a social security number. I don't know how you're going to pay someone without an SSI.
Well, no. What you need to understand, right, is social security number is only for employment payment. So there are two ways financial resources can get to a student from the university. These are the only two ways legally. One is in the form of compensation for work that flows through HR and payroll. And it's subject to all of the employment guidelines that are set out by the state and the federal government. The most significant being you need a social security number in order to get that. Separately, we have the ability to deposit funds in the form of scholarships, stipends, or fellowships directly into the financial aid account of a student. That's not employment. That doesn't go through HR. That's a scholarship. Or it could be called by various other names. But it's not employment. The student doesn't have to submit a timesheet in order to get a scholarship, right? And you don't need a social security number to get scholarship funds because they're not employment tied.
I learned that. This is good. Now
Yeah.
I'm going to follow up. How much money do we have access to that we can put in the form of a fellowship compared to all the grants that we have that can be based on work authorization? I think there's a huge imbalance between those two numbers.
No, there is a huge imbalance, and part of what we're advocating for and asking is to the extent that you are far better positioned than the two of us to raise up that issue, please share with your colleagues, share through faculty governance structures the need to create more opportunities for students financially that are not reliant upon a social security number. So I hear the reality of what you're saying. There is currently an imbalance. I'm not an accountant, and I certainly don't know all of the financials, but what I can tell you is we need to talk about that imbalance, and we need to be aware that the opportunity to help students without a social security number lies in our ability to provide grants, scholarships, and fellowships to them that are not employment related.
Yeah.
There's no way for these undocumented students to get a social security number anyway? There's no way for them to get that?
If you have DACA, you can get a social security number. DACA is going away. So even for the folks that have work authorization through DACA, that is very unlikely to last much longer. DACA is intentionally written to exclude the majority of undocumented people in this country. So the vast majority of people don't even have that temporary protection. The vast majority will never have access to a social security number. And we need to find a way to help them.
And we forget that I think immigration is so complex that, you know, students do talk about getting this sometimes like microaggression comments of like, why don't you just apply? Or just get married? Or can somebody adopt you, right? If students really had a pathway to residency, believe me, they would have applied, right? And one of the beautiful things that we do at the center, we do have an immigration attorney. So the students that you meet with, they should go actually get a legal screening to figure out whether they qualify for something or not. Because we do have some cases, right, where the student was actually not even aware that because they were a victim of a crime, there could be a pathway to residency for those students, right? So we always encourage you to encourage your students as well to seek that legal advice.
So actually research has shown that for undocumented individuals that believe themselves to have no legal option, if they sit down for a qualified and thorough legal screening, about 20% of them actually have a pathway to residency. So that's pretty significant, right? And it is important that they get that free service that we offer. And that also means, though, 80% of them are going to be where they started. And we need to figure out how to support those students at our campus, because that's, that's the commitment that we've made.
So I have a question that sort of follows up on the previous point. So in many of the STEM disciplines, the graduate students are supported less by TAships and more by funding from their PIs, federal grant, from the NIH, the NSF. And so if I'm understanding this correctly, we have a population of graduate students coming in who may be undocumented, but we don't necessarily know who they are. And so we as PIs, as we're writing grants, should be trying to craft the budget such that the graduates, the GSR position is not considered an employment position? Is that sort of the recommendation?
Yes, definitely. So 2 things about your comment, though. They are federal grants that you might not, that might have a lot of restrictions, and you may not be able to give it to an undocumented person, right? Yeah, you can't, right? For other grants,
you wouldn't necessarily know that that person is undocumented when you write them into your grant, right? That's kind of the issue.
most likely, though, your students will, if they're working closely with you, especially at the graduate level, most likely they will reveal that they're undocumented. I haven't met an undocumented graduate student that hasn't revealed their immigration status, at least to the faculty that they're working with. Even actually, we work with a student in chemistry. He does not like talking about his immigration status, and the only person in his cohort is the professor he's working with. That's the only person that knows, and actually us, and that's it. No one else knows about him.
And even though the student might not know all the technicalities of these various laws and policies, they're going to have a sense that their status is relevant to their ability to participate in federally funded programs. Like, they get that. And so they're going to self-reveal, and they're going to realize it's relevant to the work that you do.
And I do have to, acknowledge that UCI has not yet accepted an undocumented student without DACA. So out of this new cohort, those 40 students, maybe it will be the first time that we have an undocumented student without DACA, right? But as of now, the 24 students that we know of, all of them have DACA.
But then there are 14 additional ones,
and we don't know.
Somebody knows.
Okay.
Yeah.
Grad division knows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that highlights another point, somebody knows, in that there are different pockets of information in the university. It's kind of decentralized where this information lives. Yeah. And on a practical level, that's actually beneficial to the students in that there's not one place, there's not one repository with one list somewhere. Yeah. That would actually endanger them pretty significantly. Yeah. But it also means that it makes our work sometimes a little bit harder coordinating amongst those various repositories of information about undocumented students. Yes, or, sorry.
So it sounds like we could, I guess I was thinking about hearing earlier in the year that undocumented students weren't eligible for financial aid.
We have 15 minutes.
But it sounds like from what you're saying, they could get money from the PhD block in the form of a stipend. And that's...
No, not if they're not AB or F40.
Okay.
So there is, and this gets into some other complexities, some at the institutional level, some at the UCOP level. But as of right now, someone would need to be AB 540 status in order to access that funding.
So I guess I'm back to what my original question was can you give some examples of providing funding opportunities to students that they would be eligible for?
So let's say and we thought a lot about this, and the example that we were able to come up with, and I realized that it's not a fully formed one, was what we talked about. To the extent that you have the ability to control the scope of grants or how grant money is administered to students, and you're not going to have that ability in a lot of federal grants. But in others, to the extent that they exist, and we're not experts in this, you actually know this far better than we do, but we can identify the issue for you. The solution's probably going to have to be sourced from folks with more knowledge. But the issue is, to the extent that it's possible for any source of funding to be characterized as a scholarship, as opposed to be characterized by employment, that will benefit our undocumented students who are losing or may never have had federal work authorization.
I get that, which is why I went to the PhD block.
Yeah.
That you can do that with.
So the block is state money.
Yes.
State money. So you can't do it with federal money, you can't do it with state money.
Well, you can do it with state money, but only for students that meet the criteria the state has set, which is AB 540, the state law that favors a particular group of students for access to funding.
And there are a handful of students who are not AB 540, who are in their graduate.
So we may be talking about private grants, like from school or...
Yeah. And I don't want to get too bogged down in all the technicalities of this. Like I said, I think this is something that's going to take a lot of brilliant minds working a long time on to solve creatively. But to know, right, just what sort of the red flags are. And that's the piece that we can identify.
I want to go back to my faculty and say, you know, we have this problem about funding, and here are some things that you can do. And at this point, I don't actually know what are some things they can do, other than that they can look for sources of funding that don't have any restrictions, but we don't.
And I think the answer to the things we can do, it's not going to come from us, unfortunately. I wish I could give you that answer. That's a bigger conversation that needs to sort of happen within the institution.
And it's also about acknowledging, right, that this is going to be extremely hard for all of us, right? The way we are very realistic with undergraduates or even graduate students about funding, that's how you need to be with other faculty, right? The options are extremely limited, right? State funding can only go to AB 540 students. Those who are graduate students who don't qualify for AB 540, yes, it's about private. Maybe the department has the money that is not state funded, right? That the department then can decide to use that funding just for an undocumented student without a social security number, right? And I saw a lot of hands, so.
Yeah, so just a point of clarification. Yeah. So basically what you're saying is if we have private funds, if we have tuition from SSPs, if we have so donor money, we can use that money on fellowships or scholarships or stipends for undocumented grad students. My point to you would be, if you want to make this conversation go away, would be to create like a flow diagram, a chart that shows us where does money come from that can go to the undocumented students, and if it's not federal funds, then where is it coming from? And I think, especially because there's so many little caveats, AB 540, not the others, etc. It would be very helpful to have a sort of a depiction of this that we could give. I would give it out to my assistant dean, and I have a very good relationship with her.
And I think that's a great idea, and to the extent anyone here wanted to partner with us. I mean, I'm a lawyer that understands the laws as they pertain to undocumented students. I don't know what an SSP is, right? That's outside of my knowledge base. But there's people here that know the money piece that you're talking about, but don't know the legal piece I do. So to the extent that anyone here wants to help us with that assignment, I think it's a beautiful idea. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to read it, right? Let's say we want to pay these undocumented students. What are we paying them for? If we can come in that direction, maybe we can find another way. Why am I paying an undocumented student? Am I paying that undocumented student to do some work for me?
Well, you set the criteria for the fellowship, or you set the criteria for the scholarship as well, right? And you also set the boundaries, or you be very honest about when that money will be transferred. Will it be at the beginning of the quarter? Will it be after the end of the quarter once they completed X project that you gave them,
so it's
right?
about working. So I want to give, so the idea that we're talking about is paying a student for work whereas the student does not have a work permit. That's the point.
No, that's not true, and that's not what we're advocating for. Work is employment in the United States. Work is not the same thing necessarily as an investment of time, effort, and labor. Work is a very specific legal concept, and we're not advocating paying for work because they're unemployable. You can't pay them for work. They don't have a federal work permit. However, if I receive a scholarship, and part of that scholarship is that I'm producing some scholarly piece, right? I'm doing research. I'm producing a policy report at the end based on the research.
I think this is good. This
No.
over there. I have a solution.
Okay.
And if you say more, it might kill my solution.
Okay.
How about we hire Doug's office to do some scholarly work for us, and we pay? Does the money always travel with the anchor that where's it coming from, or when we pay Doug's office, it cuts the cord from the source? Then Doug's office
it maintains the funding source.
Oh, it maintains.
When you move funds, you have to move within funding sources. So if you're moving 1900 state funds to us, it has to go to a 1900 account.
Right.
So you can't erase where it's coming from.
Yeah.
So, and actually, I think Doug really wants to say something here.
Just a few things. I think one, this illustrates, who are our undocumented students, what category of undocumented status they are, to whom do they disclose, how are they legible in the system from admissions to allocating funding. And I think the third thing is that we actually are at another stage, because when you mentioned, Oscar, that your office wants to work with other people, on this issue of use of funds, I think we should pull together a group from contracts and grants in the Division of Research. Because there's probably a lot information we don't know about the limitations on private contracts and grants. So that when we do share the information to the faculty, we'll have that nice flow chart, and you can do X and Y.
Yeah.
We really need something.
Yeah, I know you had a comment.
Yeah, I was just curious as to, from your experience with dealing with grad students, what happens when they graduate? Does it continue to be not employable, right? So from them getting a PhD, do they now acquire some high-skill workforce category that allows them to obtain a job, or are we just prolonging the...
No.
Yeah.
Reverse brain drain. They could go back to where they are with a PhD that gets them a really good job.
Well,
so as of now,
that could, but so that reverse brain drain, I suppose potentially that could happen. That's not what we have actually seen in practice.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what we've seen actually happen on the ground.
Yeah. There's people, so currently there's still people with DACA, right, that have graduated with their PhDs, that actually have become professors. They have actually gone and worked for companies, X, Y, and Z. We haven't seen yet a lot of the people, right, that have graduated from programs, because as you noticed, 2 years ago, we only had 4 graduate students. This is something very, very new, and there will be a cohort in a few years, right, of maybe graduating with or without a Social Security number. We're gonna have to cross that bridge when we get there, right? But as of now, I can tell you that a lot of people that have graduated, though, have become their own independent contractor, they're consulting, because that's a way of them working legally without a Social Security number. One of the best examples, even for law school, right? The first undocumented women here in California to graduate from law school without DACA and without a Social Security number is able to practice law, because we have a California law that states that if you go to law school, you pass the bar, and you create your own practice, hey, we don't care if you're undocumented, you can do that, right? So she just opened her law firm like 3 weeks ago, right? So there's still ways, because California has been very progressive about allowing certain students, right, to be able to practice their career with an individual tax identification number rather than using a Social Security number. And I know this is extremely complicated.
Because I was wondering if it would be simpler if DACA goes away, if we can send our students to collaborate in other countries, where now that they can get legal status and then re-enter.
It may be that that's an opportunity for students, but it may also be that that's not what that student wants, right? Let's not assume the solution is shipping them somewhere else, because people have fought and risked their lives to get here. And that may be part of why they are undocumented at the time. But certainly that could be a solution for some folks. And there are actually universities internationally that have targeted DACA recipients here in the United States to go on and do graduate work there. There's a university in Mexico that's actually offering any Mexican national that had DACA in the United States and an undergraduate education here to return to Mexico and get a free graduate education at that university. So it's happening, but that is a very, very small subset. There were 4 students in the United States last year that took them up on that offer, right? So let's assume that that's gonna be a small minority of the folks, and most are gonna want to find solutions to continue to live here in the only country that they've known and that they identify as home. Now, 2 important things to know in that area too, and overlay to what Anna said. The first is that undocumented status is fluid. This is not necessarily something that's permanent for someone. People move in and out of that status. So even though the person may be undocumented right now, even if based on the complexities at play they may be unemployable right now, that doesn't necessarily guarantee where they might be 5 years from now or 10 years from now, right? The other important thing to know is that we've heard, and I know this is sort of where you were coming from or what you meant, but we've heard echoes of some of that reasoning as it relates to admissions. Why would we let someone in if we're setting them up for failure because they're not going to be able to work when they graduate? We should save them the hassle, save them the debt, let's just deny them entry. That's unlawful discrimination, and we actually have to be very, very careful not to go into that in the admissions context. But then the other piece of it too is I think kind of gets into a bigger conversation about what are the purposes of education. And certainly employability is one piece of it, but that's not the only reason someone might choose to pursue an advanced degree. There might be a lot of other far more important reasons for them why they want that PhD, why they want that JD, right? And we just have to sort of respect those reasons as students come to us, even though their unique situation might prohibit them from seeking employment right now.
Yeah. And one thing that makes our jobs hard sometimes is that every single student, it's a different situation, a unique scenario, a different option for them, right? We have students that have gone through, let's say, computer sciences or even engineering, right? And actually an alumni recently came back to us and said like, hey, my company has agreed to sponsor me. Right? So there are some even majors, right, where the person might have a pathway to residency because the companies have, have the right and are willing to pay that amount of money to sponsor someone to stay here in the United States. Yeah.
So I'm respecting
yes.
time. It is 1:30, so I just want to thank you guys for what was really informative and super, super.
Let me put our contact information. That way you can take a picture.
Send us the slides.
Yes.
Definitely.
So thank you for your time and your attention and the welcome.
Yeah, and thank you.